All right, so you want to know about chips, huh? Get ready to have your mind blown because we're talking about a technology that's more critical than oil.
And arguably just as impactful on global politics. What's fascinating here is how the history of the semiconductor industry is intertwined with major geopolitical events of the past century.
We're talking straight out of a Cold War spy thriller. Think secret labs, stolen blueprints, and a global race for technological dominance.
Absolutely. It all starts with World War II and the demand for faster, more efficient computation. Think massive rooms full of vacuum tubes and, get this, actual human computers doing calculations by hand.
No way. So how do we go from that to the chips in our smartphones?
That's where the story gets really interesting. The invention of the transistor in the late 1940s was a major turning point. But it was the integrated circuit, developed almost simultaneously by Jack Kilby at Texas Instruments and Robert Noyce at Fairchild Semiconductor, that revolutionized the industry.
Okay, stop right there. It's like a Hollywood movie. Two brilliant minds racing against the clock, completely changing the world as we know it. Did they know the impact this would have?
They certainly understood they were onto something big, but the sheer scale of the semiconductor industry today, probably unimaginable back then.
So Japan enters the picture in the 1980s. What drove them to become such a force, particularly with memory chips?
Well, part of it was a strategic focus. Japan, with its booming consumer electronics industry, needed massive amounts of memory for things like televisions and VCRs. They invested heavily in research and development, particularly in a company called Nikon.
Nikon, like the camera company.
One and the same. You see, they were also a leader in something called lithography, a process using light to etch those tiny circuits onto silicon wafers. The more precise the lithography, the smaller and more powerful the chips. And Nikon, for a while, were the masters of this technology.
So they had the tools, literally, to create the chips that powered those early electronics. But then things shifted again, right?
Yeah.
Who did the US lose that dominant edge?
It's a classic case of disruption and adaptation. In the 1980s, Japan became a major player in the memory chip market, even surpassing US production for a time. Remember those giant, clunky cell phones? Japanese companies dominated that era. It's amazing how things evolved. The US pioneered early lithography tools with companies like GCA, but the Japanese, they really took the lead. Then, from a rather unexpected place, a new player emerged the Netherlands with a company called ASML.
ASML, yeah, that name rings a bell. They're a pretty big deal in the chip industry now, right?
They're basically the dominating force in lithography these days. It's a real story of globalization, technological leaps, and just smart business strategies. ASML, they had a different approach, focusing on collaboration and integration. They didn't try to build everything themselves, instead sourcing the best parts from all over, lasers from Germany, sensors from the US, you name it.
So they built the ultimate lithography machine by sort of assembling the best of the best from everywhere.
Exactly. And their real claim to fame, extreme ultraviolet lithography. EUV for short. This technology uses a very specific wavelength of light to etch even smaller circuits onto silicon wafers. And developing it, well, it was incredibly complex and expensive. For years, people saw it as a gamble.
But ASML stuck with it, huh?
They did, and it paid off big time because now EUV is essential for creating those crazy advanced chips we see now, powering everything from, well, our smartphones to AI.
Those tiny 5 nanometer, 7 nanometer processors, those wouldn't exist without EUV, right?
Exactly. Companies like TSMC, the Taiwanese manufacturing giant, they rely heavily on these ASML machines. And this is where the whole geopolitical story takes another turn.
Okay, so we've got this cutting-edge tech, a global supply chain. How does this all tie back into those US-China tensions we were talking about earlier?
Well, remember the US restrictions on Huawei, a big part of that strategy involved ASML. Because they're the only ones with these high-end EUV machines, the US could pressure the Dutch government to block ASML from selling to China.
So by controlling access to just this one company, the US could essentially cut off China's ability to make those top-tier chips. That's pretty high stakes.
It really shows how crucial semiconductor technology has become. It's a global system, but controlling those key technologies, well, that equals power. But it's not just about the manufacturing. We need to talk about chip design too. It's another crucial aspect.
Right, you can't build something if you don't have the blueprint. But how do you even start designing something with billions of transistors? It's hard to even wrap your head around.
It is incredibly complex, but specialized software makes it possible. Remember Cadence, Synopsys, and Mentor?
You mentioned them earlier.
They're the big players in electronic design automation software, EDA for short.
And that's kind of a choke point in the industry, right?
Exactly. EDA software is essential for designing these chips. It lets engineers lay out the circuits, simulate their function, and even verify the entire design before it goes into manufacturing.
So it's like the architect's blueprint, the construction crew, and the building inspector all rolled into one. But for chips.
Perfect analogy. And here's the thing. These three companies, they dominate the EDA market, giving them huge influence over the entire industry.
So even if a chip is manufactured in, say, Taiwan or Korea, the software used to design it probably came from a US company. That's a powerful position to be in.
It definitely gives the US leverage, but it's not the whole story. Chip design itself is becoming more and more specialized. We talked about NVIDIA, their GPUs. Those are optimized for graphics and AI. They've invested a lot in their own design capabilities, creating chips tailored to those very specific applications.
So we're moving beyond just general-purpose chips into these more specialized roles.
Precisely. This specialization is really driving innovation. Take Apple, for example. They're investing heavily in designing their own chips that are optimized for their iPhones and iPads. It's part of why their products are known for that smooth, responsive user experience.
It's not just about making the smallest transistor anymore. It's about designing the entire system to work seamlessly.
Exactly. This integrated approach is only becoming more critical, especially with things like artificial intelligence. The companies that can design the best chips for specific AI tasks, they're going to have a serious advantage. But it's not just about smaller and faster anymore. We're seeing fundamental shifts happening in the industry.
What do you mean? I thought smaller, faster, more powerful was still the name of the game.
It's been the mantra for decades, but we're starting to hit some walls. Remember Moore's law, the idea that the number of transistors on a chip doubles every 2 years or so?
Yeah, the golden rule of the industry.
Right, but there are signs it's slowing down.
So what happens when we hit that wall? Does innovation just stop?
Not at all. It's forcing the industry to think outside the box. We're seeing more focus on new materials, new architectures, even entirely new ways of computing.
Okay, now this is where things get really interesting. Give me some examples.
One that's generating a lot of buzz is quantum computing. It's a totally different approach to processing information based on quantum mechanics.
Quantum computing. That sounds incredibly complex, almost like science fiction. Is it actually viable, or are we talking decades away?
It's still early days, but the progress has been impressive. Companies like Google, IBM, Microsoft, they're all putting resources into this. We're already seeing promising applications in fields like drug discovery, materials science, even cryptography.
So quantum computers could be like the next transistor, the next integrated circuit in terms of their impact.
They're definitely a contender, but they're not alone. Another fascinating area is neuromorphic computing, which is actually inspired by the human brain.
Wait, are we talking about chips designed to mimic the brain?
Essentially, yes. Neuromorphic chips are designed to process information in a more parallel, distributed way, much like how neurons interact in our brains. This has huge potential for AI, robotics, a lot of fields, really. And these new approaches, they're not just about speed. They're about tackling problems that traditional computers struggle with.
It's incredible how far we've come from those room-sized computers to these futuristic technologies. It really makes you wonder, what will the next 50 years bring? What other breakthroughs are out there?
It's a really exciting time to be following the chip industry. The innovation just keeps accelerating, and the stakes are higher than ever.
This deep dive has been pretty mind-blowing. From those first room-sized computers to these futuristic technologies, it makes you wonder, what's next? What should our listeners be watching for in the coming years? What's the key takeaway?
Well, if this deep dive has taught us anything, it's that the future of technology, maybe even the world, really hinges on these tiny little chips.
Absolutely. So what should our listeners be paying attention to?
I'd say keep your eye on those companies developing the next generation of chip-making tech.
Could you give us an example?
Sure. Take extreme ultraviolet lithography, EUV. Now, this technology, it's so complex, it's almost like something out of science fiction.
It really does sound futuristic.
But EUV could determine the future of the industry. It could even shift global power.
EUV, huh? Definitely something to keep an eye on. If you thought all this was just about silicon and circuits, well, think again. We've gone from Cold War espionage to AI, all thanks to the incredible world of chips.